The ship has reached the shore.
Over 200 countries have come to an agreement to protect the world's oceans. It's called the High Seas Treaty, and it aims to transform 30% of the planet's oceans into protected areas by 2030. The pact has been in the works for over 10 years, and after 38 hours of talks at UN headquarters in New York this week, a deal has finally been reached. Now, Susanna Fuller with Oceans North was actually on the ground during the negotiations. She joins us now with the details. Susanna, it's a privilege to have you on our show today.
Oh, thank you so much for paying attention to the high seas.
It's been a busy week for you. What was it like attending this week's negotiations, and did you think this deal was going to be reached?
Yeah, I did. So this last 2 weeks were the last negotiating session. We almost reached a deal in August and not quite, and so they decided on another 2 week session. We had high hopes from the very beginning that the agreement would be reached by the end of the week, but as is usual with these things, trade-offs and compromises happen at the last minute. So we had very Friday didn't end. Friday started at 9 in the morning, and Friday went until last night at 10 o'clock. So the countries really had to work hard to finalize the details and to make some compromises in areas where there were some key differences between countries. As you can imagine, it's difficult to get so many countries to come to an agreement, particularly when there's so many differences between countries. There are landlocked countries, there are countries with very large coastal areas that are adjacent to the high seas. But yes, we had high hopes that it would be reached, and it was a really exciting moment last night when it was.
Sounds like long days, lots of talking, but as mentioned, roughly 30% of the world's oceans will be designated as protected areas. Do we know where specifically this will be implemented and what kinds of protections might be put in place?
Yeah, so the 30% number actually comes from the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in Montreal in December. This treaty just enables that to happen in areas outside national jurisdiction. So until we have this agreement, which still needs to be ratified and put into force, we didn't have the tools to do marine protected areas or environmental impact assessments outside areas of national jurisdiction. So it's early days. There's certainly some areas like some high seas seamount areas that we know are very important from a biodiversity perspective. We know there's areas like the Sargasso Sea. There's the thermal dome off of Costa Rica. Many areas have been identified by scientists over time as really important. It is early days to understand which ones might be protected by 2030. There's a lot of work to do. The treaty, first of all, the treaty has to be fully adopted. We have text, but because they weren't able to translate in time for adoption, that will happen in the coming weeks. Then the number of countries to actually ratify the treaty is 60. So we need 60 countries to sign on and say, yes, they will implement it and fully ratify it in their own countries. And then we get into implementation. So there's much work to do. The 2 decades of work to get here. Now we're at a stage where we can start to do the next decade of work, I would say. But what will happen now, I think, is scientists will really start to coalesce around some areas. And just because an area is scientifically important, it also needs to be supported by the coastal countries around it. Need to look at what other activities are happening there. There's a whole bunch of things. Just as it's hard to get protected areas within a country's waters, it will be a lot of work, and all the pieces need to come together. But certainly, people are going to start thinking on Monday about how to start to advance some of these areas. But we don't expect them to be designated until 2030, and we'll see how much of the high seas gets protected. I think it remains to be seen. The 30% commitment is for within country waters and also on the high seas. But I think there's probably 4 or 5 areas that will be advanced, and that countries will try and get protected within the first decade of the treaty for sure.
Hopefully the deal gets ratified sooner rather than later. But what will it mean for our planet, for climate?
Well, I think the key thing, that one of the best things we can do for our climate, besides really reducing our fossil fuels emissions, is to protect areas and allow them to become more resilient. The less human impact we have on ecosystems, the better they're able to adapt. So we know there's key areas that still need to be protected in Antarctica. There is some protection in the Arctic, but we can protect it from shipping and other activities. There are seamount areas that we know are really, really fragile and are potentially, targeted for deep sea bed mining. So we want to make sure that those are also protected, just to keep, allow nature to be as unimpacted as possible, so that it can adapt to climate change, because the oceans have absorbed about 90% of the excess heat that we have created through climate change, and really need some help in just being able to be as resilient as possible.
Still lots of work to do. Hopefully we get there. Susanna Fuller with Oceans North, thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.